So I'm just using that. You can see I'm kind of like wiping and lightening at the same time. You can make alterations. If you need to kind of get too much paint on the brush, you can just stroke it off there. I'm using that to kind of sort of, it's almost like erasing. So it's kind of like if you're using a razor and a charcoal drawing to go back into the painting a bit, adjust the tones that way. Because generally we've got our lighter sort of hair tones in this kind of closer section, and then as they go back, they get darker. So working kind of in reverse now, I can pop back in some of these little darker notes where need be, where I had them already and then lost them. So it's not too bad for the hair. Maybe there's a few little points where I might just try to remove a little bit more paint. And then maybe just go back. So there's some places where we'd already had it sort of merging up into the background, the darks of the hair, and I just want to sort of lose some of those edges again almost. That's not too bad for the hair as a kind of general first pass over, and probably sufficient for a for a wash drawing, because this is ultimately just the base layer of a painting. You can use these as finished pieces as well. So if you spend a lot of time on them, they can be nice little finished sketches in their own right. But in theory, it's the basis for a larger piece. So we've got pretty much all of our background stuff in, our drapery, our hair, which means we can now start to go and sort of mess around a bit with primarily the shadows in the face. We'll also do a little bit of starting to kind of suggest some halftones. We're going to be limited in terms of how much we can do with halftones, just because, as I said, we're just working with kind of lighter or darker burnt umber, and we can't get any lighter than this. We can go kind of start to sort of suggest quite a lot of detail, though, even just with that kind of limited basis to work from. So again, the first thing, I'm going to be using the smaller brush now. And the first thing I want to do is go in and just try to find the darkest portions. So this little kind of note in here, there is just the slightest little suggestion of a reflected light just above that pupil. So I'm going to try to capture that, but then back up here where the brow is, that's dark again. But we'll just really sort of faintly get that, just an ever so slight shift into a reflected light. We've then got the eyelids, which sort of make this sort of almost ring of shadow. And they go a little bit lighter, so the white of the eye is lighter, and then they're a bit darker, and sort of slightly lighter again. What we're looking for here is just a lot of control over how much tone we're adding. Don't worry if it's a bit of a struggle. It takes practice, this. But what it provides is a good sort of general sort of skill level with handling paint in other sort of areas of the painting. So when you actually get to kind of adding color, if you can sort of handle paint fairly effectively just using burnt umber and your medium like this, you'll find it becomes a lot easier, and you can sort of do a lot more when you're working with the rest of the painting, working on more detailed sections, or you're working with multiple colors at once. But it's also starting to become, you can sort of see why it's called wash drawing. So particularly as we get into this stage, it becomes a lot more like drawing, because you can almost sort of sketch with the brush a bit. There's all sorts of different sort of methods of application that you can use. And the major variables are just how much sort of paint you've got on the brush, how dry that paint is, and how much mineral spirits you've added to your mixture or to your paint. And you'll start to get a feel for, you know, what effect a certain amount of mineral spirits will have on the way that the paint is applying to the surface. The sorts of brush strokes that you can make. I'll just zoom in a bit for this section because I'm mostly working quite close in around the mouth, so you can just see a bit more closely what I'm doing, sort of how the paint's being applied. So now that I've wrapped my way down to the nose, I can sort of start to sort of link back up through these very subtle, quite complex shadow shapes. It's got tiny little bits of things like the light on that left-hand side of the nose we want to try to capture, but then it drops in to a sort of semi-shadow just here, and then we just about lose that shadow, but we will find some of that tone when we're sort of working on halftones. But for the time being, we're going to stick with just trying to focus on these shadows. And that wraps back up there. Nothing in this area is a shadow, so we'll ignore that for the time being. I feel like I've maybe made my mouth a little bit too high, so I'm going to try to drop that down a bit and sort of encourage the sense of this, if I go back with this sort of scrubbing brush that I have, just take a little bit of paint off, sort of smudge it down a bit, because there is that moustache anyway. So we can sort of smudge down into that, and then just to raise back into it a bit, I'm going to use a little bit of kitchen roll, paper towel. So that's allowing me to drop a little bit there. Then I need to still kind of cut it back over. Make sure my tilt is still there on the left-hand side of the face. And we've got this kind of little smudgy shape for his moustache dropping down there. It's not too bad, I would say, for that kind of nose-mouth connection. I'm going to be working up into here a little bit for the halftones. After we've moved around this ear, we've still got this ear to go. This eye to go. So same thing, just kind of working our way around inside this eye shadow. You can take your time. So again, I'm just keeping an eye out for things like that little reflected light there. And again, we've got this dark pupil, which merges into the shadow on the inner top eyelid. Don't really know why, but I always find eyes actually tend to come together a bit more easily with paint than in drawing. I don't know if it's because the ability to kind of manipulate the brush into shapes like the eye shape kind of makes it a bit easier or something. So hopefully you find it the same. Can be practice as well. So if you need to, so I kind of need to just boost some of the darks in this eye. I'm quite happy with the shapes, but there are certain sections which maybe could go a bit darker. That's not too bad. And then final thing to sort of think about is just the shapes in this ear, or the final thing for this section. We're still going to be carrying on doing more halftones. But for the shadows, there are some shadows in the ear. You don't have to be super detailed with them. People don't always look at the ear that much, but they're not too complex if you sort of break them down. I need to do a little video about the ear. It doesn't probably quite warrant a full class, but zoom out just enough that you can see the painting in roughly its entirety, and give you kind of like maybe 3 or 4 minutes to catch up. So I'll carry on now. Hopefully you're roughly caught up. Obviously, like if we'll have a little bit of time at the end where everyone can carry on working anyway. But I think at this rate, because we've got about a bit less than an hour left, we should probably finish roughly on time. Sometimes with drawings we go over a little bit. But these sorts of paintings, they come together quite kind of nicely and quickly. It's not really, you're not meant to spend an enormous amount of time on them. So about 2 to 2.5 hours is sort of ideal, I would say, which is what we've got. So what I want to do now is start to use similar sorts of techniques that we were using in those shadows, just to start to build a little bit of a sense of some of the darker halftones. So particularly down this left-hand side of the face. So we're not really going to get up into this section here, which is all quite light. In fact, I would probably say where that's smudged slightly, if I can lighten it, I will. So I'm just going to take a little bit of mineral spirits and just try to scrub back into it. Yeah, that has actually cleaned up. Sometimes you can't always get it off. So trying to make sure you don't want to put so much mineral spirits onto the surface that it starts to run everywhere and wipe out everything that you've just done. So if that happens, try to catch it, the excess mineral spirits. Apologies for that noise. So yeah, that's a bit lighter now. What we're essentially looking for are starting to get a suggestion of some modeling. So I have just noticed that I probably need to go a bit darker, sort of scrub in some slightly darker tones, just down in this beard, so where the beard overlaps. Just totally ignored that earlier. I just realized. You can sort of paint back into it. You'll find if you're sort of displacing the paint a bit, you can push it sort of down. You can kind of almost move that dark paint down into the the area that you want to go darker, or if you're kind of lightening an area above something darker, it's a good way to kind of use your paint, use your brush strokes. Anything you can do that sort of makes things quicker or more efficient or kind of work together, it always feels quite natural, I think, to the painting. So it's good to kind of to work that way. So yeah, what we want to do is start to capture some of these darker halftones, particularly sort of looping down into the sort of around the neck, for instance. So this neck, it's not going to be as dark as the shadows, but it would pay for it to be a bit darker than the collar next to it. So what we want to try to do is just get just the right amount of sort of washy paint on our little brush, just really thinly, almost kind of glazing it over the surface of the painting. If you take it, so it's the last thing we do, just because hopefully by this point you're starting to feel a bit more confident with your application. You can sort of apply a little bit like that, smooth, smudge it with the other brush, take it off entirely if need be with the paper towel. So there's a lot of flexibility. So don't stress out too much as you're doing it. So the ear, for instance, the top of this ear is darker than the bottom. So we can give a suggestion of how the light is catching that ear just by popping in some slightly darker tones. So moving up to the top here, you can kind of move your way around when you're doing this. There's no particular order you necessarily have to follow. So up here goes particularly dark, this sort of plane of the forehead. you can apply a bit of paint with your one brush and then kind of smudge and move it around with the other that has less paint. It's generally a reasonable technique to follow. So here I know that I've gone a little bit too dark on that left-hand side, but I'm not too worried. I can just start to lift it, keep cleaning the brush, so I can just wipe the brush off, lift more paint, wipe the brush off. It's a little bit like, sort of like watercolor painting with paint that never dries. It's probably one way to think of it. So if you're familiar with watercolor painting. Not that I'm a watercolor painter, so that could be a totally wrong way to describe it. But that's how I always feel wash drawing is. But the more you get down at this stage, so obviously, I mean, you could leave it at this point. It would be totally fine to paint over as you carry the piece on. But the more you get down, the easier you'll find subsequent layers. So you could almost sort of go to glazing. So you could just glaze some skin tones over. You might need to reinforce some of the darks because we couldn't quite go, pure dark. We can't go pure white. But we've got a lot of the work done already, and we can kind of just lift and darken things from here and be pretty confident about the shapes, the forms of the painting. So it does pay to kind of get a reasonable amount of detail built up at this stage. So it's not too bad for that brow in terms of turning the forms. Maybe a little bit just on the right hand side, because I did a lot of work on that left hand side, so it might benefit from just a little bit of turning that way. Yeah, generally not too bad. So we can kind of just keep dropping down the portrait now. Just the same approach. It's fairly tricky down this left-hand side of the cheek when you get to that, if you're working on it. So take your time with it. It's got quite a lot of fairly complex little transitions going on. But the primary thing you want to think about, you've got this sort of light shape, this light shape here, just in the core of the cheek. And then it's quite soft. So all what makes it tricky is all these other transitions. They're quite soft down into, say, this little kind of corner here, up into the rest of the eye and so forth. But that's not too bad. And then it's quite important to get some transitions out of the nose to sort of give a sense of it turning. A lot of the nose is in light, so we're really working down a very narrow sort of stretch of the nose in terms of creating transitions. So kind of only a few millimeters out from the shadow edge, we're trying to kind of create a form, a turned form. You might find it helps. So say you've got something that has ended up a little bit smudgy, if you just go in, just kind of reassert where the edge of the shadow is, sometimes helps a bit, keeps things manageable. Because you don't want to lose those shadow edges even as we're softening things out. Yeah, it's not too bad. So we can carry on. I'm just going to keep working my way across. So now dropping down into the mouth, which has quite a lot of dark tones. So the lips, because they're red is always quite a dark local color. So they're actually a reasonably dark tone, just kind of inherently the lips. And then also they're sort of in shadow as well. So we have to bear that in mind. The main sort of light shape we have down here in the lower chin is just this little sort of light core that we get just underneath. So we want to try to preserve that, but everything else can go reasonably dark down here. In terms of the overall sort of big form modeling of the head, this is most definitely very light up in the forehead, and everything up that sort of moves away from that gets darker. With the exception of this collar, this bright collar. As a side note, it was typical in traditional portraits like this to pop in a very light shape just underneath the face as a compositional tool, because we always look inherently at the point of highest contrast, or kind of immediately we look at the point of highest contrast when we first look at a painting. And so what would happen is people would look at the point of the collar, which is quite a simple shape, and then their eyes would rise up into the face. Whereas if this was the lightest point, we would kind of look at the forehead, and then our eyes would kind of try to go up rather than go down, which wouldn't be ideal. At least that was the thinking behind it. So that's why you very often see white collars in paintings. It's very common. Think of like Dutch still life, Dutch portraits. Rembrandt, for instance, always has lots and lots of bright white collars underneath everyone's faces. So again, on this side, we've got these quite soft halftones sort of transitioning up out of the beard lower down. It'd be nice to try to capture some of that, but it is tricky. So I'm just using this smaller brush and kind of gradually scrubbing my way up, but most likely I'll go too dark. If I go too dark, I can start to kind of pull it back a bit with paper towel. If I need to take even more off, I can use mineral spirits as well. Or I've got this brush, I can give that a crack. That's not doing too badly. It's got a little bit too much mineral spirits on it, so it's sort of smearing the paint around, which is not ideal. You can see it's leaving ridges. If that happens, just try to give it a clean with some of your paper towel. Get it to be a bit drier before going back to using it. Which then leads me up to sort of the final section of halftone that needs to be painted, and that's the just this eye. It's been another fairly complex form. It's sort of moving from complex form to complex form, but sorry, we lost a little bit of the. I've lost a little bit of dark paint there, so I just want to go in and kind of reinforce that. Make sure that's nice and dark before going in with the halftones. And then again, the halftones I can sort of pull out. We have them on top, actually. We'd already put them in from the sort of top as we were working up into the forehead. But we are missing these softer transitions down from the bottom of the eye. So try to get those in. Just working the same way. Sort of feeding them down into it. Just need to take the edge slightly off the the whites of the eyes and the highlight just on the top of the bottom lid. So you've always got this, when the light is illuminated, when the eye is illuminated like this, you very often will have a little light catching the top of the bottom lid. So a suggestion of that to be in place, but we don't want it to distract. We don't want it to be too bright because it's still sort of a halftone, you can see. So again, I've lost a little bit too much in terms of how dark the iris and the pupil go there. So I want to go back in and just make sure that's sufficiently dark. And that's not too bad. So again, I'm going to give you a little bit of time just to catch up, probably another 4 or 5 minutes or so. And then we'll have about 20 minutes left to kind of go over and make adjustments here or there. But hopefully it's starting to sort of close into being a reasonable copy. And have all the information that we want for this this wash drawing. So I'll wait till sort of about 10 past or so, and then we'll have about 20 minutes for the last section. So I'm just gonna, for this last section, give my brushes a little bit of a clean, just using some of the small amount of mineral spirits I've left. And I'm gonna primarily, so at this stage, I'm fairly happy with what's going on in the face. I don't want to adjust it too much because I may end up overworking it, which is definitely a risk. I'm fairly happy with how it looks at the moment. The only things I might do is just sort of using some sort of cleanings, or using some mineral spirits, just wipe out some of the lightest bits that I want to get into the head, just in case there's any section where I've ended up with a little bit of tone that I don't want. I have a feeling it's about as light as it's going to go. But yeah, just up there in the forehead, I think would be worth looking for. But yeah, that seems fine. I can also go in, I just want to lighten the hair slightly, and at the same time just soften that edge of the hair there. I don't want it to feel quite so abrupt as it did. I'm a bit happy with that. I don't want it to feel, if things are that sort of cut out, they'd start to look a bit more graphic, which is not ideal. I also feel like this hair in here is a little bit scratchy, so I'm just going to go in and sort of smooth that out a bit. It'll have become sort of moderately sticky. By this stage. So when you sort of try to smudge it out, you might kind of shift it. It might become a little bit annoying that it's sticky, but also it does allow you to sort of create slightly kind of nicer little smudgy effects that would have been difficult when you first laid it in. So we can get that sort of really soft hair at that back edge. Up here as well, can sort of just mess around a little bit with the edge of the hair. As I say, I'm not going to go into the anything really in the face, I don't think, unless something catches my eyes. I'm trying to kind of just look at everything in total and see what if anything seems off, and just try to focus on those things. I don't want to fiddle unnecessarily. There is a little bit more, so what we can really spend a bit of time on is some places like here I could really load, where I want it to be really dark, take my pure burnt umber and really just load that in, because I'm really definite about that now. So I can go push that sort of as dark as it goes in these areas. Hair on this side as well can go about that dark. So all those sort of darkest notes of the painting I can push just a bit further at this point. It's not really worth doing this till right at the end, because you'll find you'll kind of lose, as you're shifting things around a bit in the earlier stages of the painting, you'll lose that darkness anyway. So it's kind of a good thing to just sort of leave till right at the end. And at this stage, I can also go through and just start to look for, there are a few little bits, kind of nice little details on the drapery. So got so far with everything else that I'm sort of happy to go back and start to just shift in some, or add in some little bits and pieces here and there of detail in the drapery. It's not something I would sort of prioritize, but if you find you have time at this stage, have a go at that. So there's a few things like some little buttons that you can just about make out, I should say. This one in here. It's a nice little detail to catch if you can. And that also kind of starts to connect a bit that sort of buttoned over coat that he's wearing. I think I listed this painting as being by Fantin-Latour, but, and I think I got this right at the beginning of the class, I think it's actually a painting of the artist Fantin-Latour by Carolus Duran, just for your potentially unnecessary detail to know about it. But Fantin-Latour is more famous as he's an artist as well, but he's more famous as a flower painter, very good rose painter in the 19th century, whereas Carolus Duran is a lot more famous as a portrait painter. He, if any of you know Sargent, he was Sargent's teacher. And he ran the main painting atelier in France in the sort of late 19th century, in Paris. Well, France, Paris. So got about 10 minutes or so left. So one other thing in the drapery that I could work on, or I'd like to work on, is the that white collar. Be quite nice to just catch a suggestion of some of the shadows, sort of from the folds within it. But because it's white, obviously they're going to be, I just totally messed that up. I was trying to work upwards and then ended up making a mess of what I already had. So I'll just have to clean that up. So I just want to, partly ended up with too much paint on my brushes. If you end up with too much paint and it's giving you trouble, just stop and give everything a good clean and sort of start from square one. Otherwise you'll just end up accidentally adding loads of paint unnecessarily. It's a bit better. Yeah, it's not too bad. So what I was trying to do is just adjust the top of this collar before working on the rest of it. Yeah, it's not too bad. So we've got this one little shadow that kind of runs up. Runs up there. Another one that sort of wraps out the back of the collar there. And it's a little bit darker at this edge here than as it goes inward, it starts to kind of lighten off a bit, the core of the shadow. There, that's not too bad. Just make sure there's a slightly darker tone up there at the neck, just to... There's quite a big contrast between that collar and the bottom of the neck. But generally, it's not too much more necessary. One of the final things I'll be doing, I'll probably start to do now, because everything seems roughly in place, is just go and reinforce anywhere where I wanted to make sure I had really dark notes. So in the eyes, for instance, we've already kind of gone through them, but they always just sort of fade off slightly. So it's good to, as you're working through it, just keep gradually reinforcing those darkest points. And then by this stage, this is your sort of final pass over all your shadows, and you can go hopefully as dark as it'll need to go. That's about it probably for what we need in terms of our... So everything being blocked in. We've got about kind of 7 to 8 minutes left. So I'm just going to keep tweaking mine, but that's pretty much it in terms of the process. And a lot of it with this sort of thing is, have a go at this one, working from this piece, and then apply the same thing to one of your own portraits, or you can do other copies, as long as you've got reasonable references to work from. And just sort of gradually build up more confidence with your brushwork. As I say, it does actually apply to quite a lot of different aspects of the rest of the painting process, these skills. So it's a really good way to just kind of practice your brushwork, try out different types of brushes, see how they sort of affect or allow you to do different brush strokes or change things in different ways. But it's really primarily a sort of brushwork exercise, this one. Value in brushwork. So it's sort of like drawing, but also can get your hand a bit sort of more confident with a range of different types of brush strokes that you maybe wouldn't attempt if you were preoccupied with mixing your colors. But what you would do, so this is a basis for a portrait painting. If you were to carry it on, and you can carry this on, so you've got the original, you could turn it into a sort of master copy, which would be fun, I think. But you basically, you allow this to dry, be completely dry, so you don't want it, if it's at all wet, when you kind of start painting over the top of it, it'll mix in, which is generally just how we go about oil paintings. You always want your layers to be dry before you add, before you work subsequent layers over the top. but pretty much touch dry is sufficient. For burnt umber, a burnt umber wash drawing, that'll probably be, at least probably 2 days, depending on the weather, maybe a bit faster at this time of year. But different paints will have different drying speeds. So you would allow it to dry, and then this just becomes your basis for the whole painting, really. As I said before, you could just glaze over the top of this. So a fairly standard traditional method was to just use this as your basis, and you kind of mix up your sort of flesh tone color, and you just glaze that over the top of the lights. You might start to glaze some reds over the lips, some darker tones for the shadows. And that's your dead coloring. And then from there, you could start to sort of model the forms. But what I'd recommend is you sort of use this as your basis for direct painting the rest of the tones. So I'm just going to zoom out off my video, wherever my controller is. So I'm just going to zoom out, swivel across a little bit, and zoom back in. So from sort of this basis, you would then start to gradually place, you can see they're fairly sort of solid, definite brushstrokes that he's painted in. So you'd sort of start to place your lightest tones into the forehead, light tones for the bridge of the nose, and then just sort of gradually placing, similar to how we were sort of roughing in the halftones, you start to place those halftone values that turn the form of the face into the shadows. The shadows probably you get away with glazing, actually. So the shadows you just sort of wash over dark, like black where you need it, over most of the background, which is more grayish. The beard would probably stay roughly burnt umbery, I would say. It wouldn't actually need to shift that much because it's sort of naturally reddish. And you'll find once you were to lay ivory black into this painting, ivory black's quite blue, so it'll make all of this look really orangey. There are some other places you can sort of see, I think there's a sense that in the beard, the underpainting is actually showing through slightly, and that's what you could do here. So you don't paint over all of it, you just alter it where it needs to be altered. So that might mean kind of glazing things like raw umber into the shadows, maybe some more burnt umber over to reinforce bits. A reasonable amount of black, bit of sort of grays. You can see it goes quite grayish down that left-hand side. And then just building these forms up. But if you've got a painting sort of at this level, it's not too hard to know where to place those shapes correctly. So this is why this is sort of roughly what you're looking for in terms of finish and style. Yeah, so that's the general sort of principle behind a wash drawing.